My guest today is the great professor of music, William Caplin. Caplin specializes in the theories of musical form and musical cadence. His extensive investigations into formal procedures of late 18th century music culminated in a 1998 book, Classical Form, A Theory of Formal Functions for the Instrumental Music of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, published by Oxford University Press, which won the 1999 Wallace Berry Book Award from the Society of Music Theory. A textbook version analyzing classical form and approach for the classroom, also by Oxford University Press, was published in November 2013. In addition to writing many scholarly articles, Caplin served as president of the Society for Music Theory from November 2005 to November 2007. In March 2015, he was the Robert M. Trotter Visiting Professor at the School of Music, University of Oregon. In March 2008, he was Visiting Professor at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. He is currently writing a large-scale book project entitled Cadence, a study of closure in tonal music. Professor Caplin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. Great to talk to you.
Now, you actually answered a previous interview when somebody asked you about how should someone start off with your work. And you said, my own particular theory is strongly rooted on a very solid grounding in the fundamentals of harmony. It's pretty tough to go very far in my own theoretical approach without a clear grasp of harmonic analysis. So I'd actually like to start there. And in reading your work, just in a general sense in music theory, there are quite a few competing theories for harmony. And I've noticed you've written some reviews of some famous theorists like Sechter and all sorts of other theorists. So actually, I'd like to start there. How do we make sense of harmony now?
Okay, so it's interesting because I studied harmony in so many different ways from so many different teachers. I studied with Nadia Boulanger in the summer when I was in music school. I, of course, took courses in harmony in music school. And even in my graduate studies, I was a teaching assistant for the composer Easley Blackwood, who also was very interested in harmonic systems. And so I gained an appreciation of harmony. But to be honest, it wasn't until I was hired at McGill and I started teaching as a full-time academic and had the opportunity to really try to deal with issues of musical form. And in the course of doing that, it became clear to me that in order to say anything really interesting about form of music, the phrase structure, how pieces are put together, I really did need to have a very solid grasp of harmony. And in fact, it was studying form that made me understand why harmony was so important, something that I didn't quite understand in all the different times I had studied it.
You've mentioned this in some of your writing, that form really hasn't really been analyzed very seriously in the 20th century. I mean, Schoenberg wrote a book on it, but it hasn't been tackled like, say, just general harmony has. Could you comment on perhaps the lack of analysis on overall form?
Right. Well, this was something that became clear to me as I started to become interested in this field. And I think that the reason why form was neglected, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, was because Schenkerian theory rose to such prominence. And I don't know if your listeners are aware of what Schenker did and his interest, but he was very largely interested in the background contrapuntal structures of musical compositions. And he felt that the foreground analysis of formal procedures were in some sense incidental to the true organic nature of a piece. And given the rise of Schenker and his actually quite hostile attitudes towards the theory of form, many music theorists just simply stayed away from the topic. I was very lucky to have been introduced to it when I was studying in Germany, working on my dissertation. The dissertation, in fact, was on all of these harmonic theorists of Rameau and Vogler and Kirnberger, Sechter, Riemann, and the like. But when I was studying in Germany, I was introduced to the more traditional German Formenlehre, and particularly the writings of Erwin Ratz, who was a student of Schoenberg. And in fact, my entire approach to musical form is built upon Schoenberg's and Ratz's foundation. That is a very different tradition than the Schenkerian tradition. So it allowed me to kind of approach the topic with fresh ears, let's say, and kind of a clean mind about what I was trying to do.
Just so people know, there's certain traditions in theory. So, for instance, there's the Viennese fundamental bass theory. there's German functional theory. Could you quickly just comment for my audience just so they can understand what's competing against each other here?
Sure. So in the rise of harmonic theory towards the end of the 18th century, Rameau introduced harmonic theory in the early part of the 18th century. By the later part of the 18th and early into the 19th century, people started to analyze harmony in terms of the roots of the 7 chords built on the diatonic scale. This was called the step theory, the idea that every single step of the scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, on every one of those pitches, you could build a triad, and that would be an individual harmony. And we started to use Roman numerals to indicate those individual scale steps. Late in the 19th century, the theorist Hugo Riemann said, well, really, there are less than 7 individual harmonies, but there are really only 3 harmonic functions: tonic, subdominant, and dominant. And so these were 2 major competing theories. Today, we kind of integrate the 2. We use Roman numeral analysis quite extensively to give a very detailed description of the harmonies, but at the same time, we use a kind of modification of Riemann's theory and say, well, certain of those individual triads, let's say the tonic number 1 or the submediant, the 6th degree triad, those both represent a sense of tonic harmony. Likewise, there are predominant harmonies that include subdominants and augmented 6th chords, the Neapolitan 6th chord. These are all a collection of different harmonies that want to lead to the dominant. The dominant itself has a variety of different manifestations. So these are the 2 competing theories. My approach follows largely in the Viennese tradition of the step theory and the use of Roman numerals to analyze. But I also talk in my book about tonic function, subdominant or predominant function, dominant function, and the like. And I then try to link the kinds of progressions of these harmonies into types that support the musical form and phrase structure.
Now, why did you choose to select the quote-unquote classical period of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven as the basis for your theoretical work?
Okay, this is really interesting. And it's one of those just amazingly lucky things that happened to me in my career. When I moved to McGill University, I had just been studying in Berlin, as I mentioned, with the very famous musicologist Karl Dahlhaus. He was the one who introduced me to the theory of form of Ratz that I was referring to. I arrived at McGill and they said, well, we want you to teach a course on musical form, and we want you to focus on the composers of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. So this was not my decision. And so I started looking around in the textbooks, and I noticed that in the standard form textbooks, they covered a huge amount of music. The theory of form that I studied with when I was a graduate student, when I was a musical student, was Wallace Berry's book on form and music. Well, Berry's book covers the music from the Gregorian chant up till the latest, 12-tone compositions. And many of the other textbooks were rather broad in the scope of their music. And I was trying to think, well, how am I going to teach a course that focuses basically on Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven? And then it became clear to me that, well, Schoenberg's theory himself focused primarily on these composers. And so it seemed that I just was lucky that I fell into a kind of limitation of the repertoire, which allowed me to develop, I think, a richer approach to form than perhaps had been the case when theorists were trying to cover so many different musical styles. So by restricting it to one style where I believe form is very essential to the style, perhaps more essential than any of the other forms. So it was in those situations that I was able to develop a theory, and just luckily, McGill asked me to do it.
Now, can I ask you, why selecting Viennese fundamental-based theory? What is it about German functional theory that you decided was not useful to you in formulating your theory?
Well, I should say, first of all, I think it was useful to me. I speak regularly of tonics going to dominance. I speak of the 6th chord as a tonic substitute, things like that. So I'm by no means opposed to the German tradition. I think the principal one is pragmatic. Most music students in North America are conversant with the Roman numeral system. And if I were starting to use the the function theory symbols, they perhaps would not be as comfortable with that approach. I do have actually, come to think of it now, it did occur to me that there is an aspect of functional theory that I think is problematic for the work that I'm doing. As a general rule, Riemann and his followers who developed the function theory were not so terribly interested in the baselines were supporting the musical ideas. And what I've come to believe, and this is something that has really grown for me over my 40 years now of teaching this material, is that the baseline is where all the action is with respect to harmony, with respect to form, with respect to phrase structure, all of those issues. It's in the baseline that we learn this. Now, many musicians and many listeners primarily listen to the upper voice. They listen to the melodies, they listen to the tunes, they listen maybe to the motives. But the baseline gives so much important information. And the Roman numeral analysis, when combined with a figured bass analysis, which is pretty much what North American harmonic theory does, you put together a sense of what is the harmonic function, but what is the baseline that's supporting these harmonies. Because I believe that the very specific different inversions or positions of the chords are extraordinarily important for the kind of work that I do. So my theory of form is dependent upon a theory of harmony that is very precise about what the harmonic function is, what the chord actually is, and specifically the position of the chord as defined by the bass line.
Just to further probe into this now, so the Viennese fundamental bass theory, this idea of a fundamental bass, how is that different as well from figured bass theory?
Okay, well, figured bass theory was developed before harmonic theory. Figured bass theory basically is interested in chords, largely intervals, intervallic simultaneities, if you will, chordal structures. And they define what the intervals are that consist within these chords in relation to the bass. Now, because the bass is important, figured bass is a baseline-oriented theory. But what figured bass leaves out is the notion of harmonic motion and harmonic succession and how chords progress one from the other. Figured bass theory doesn't really have a theory of that. It has a theory of what are chords in music as opposed to entities that would not be considered chords. But they don't really deal with the succession of harmonies. So today we draw on all sorts of different traditions. We use the figured bass tradition to give us a sense of the intervallic structure of the harmonies. We use harmonic theories, either the fundamental bass theory or the function theory, to discuss how harmonies progress one from the next.
This is a question that's always bugged me, and I've asked very smart people about this. And do chords have, or at least bass notes, like for instance 5 to 1, and we're going to talk about cadences, does 5 want to go to 1? Is that an inner urge that 5 has, the bass note 5? Is there an innate function within that 5 resolving to 1?
Right. Well, this is a big question, of course, are there such things as these innate properties which explain how it is that notes move where they do?
Right.
And music theorists generally invoke a wide range of metaphors to try to explain it. They speak of magnetic attraction, or they speak of gravity. Even Jean-Philippe Rameau, who introduced the idea of a dominant going to a tonic, he said, well, the fundamental bass of the dominant is the fifth above the tonic. And since that's an overtone, it's a fundamental sonority of the tonic. And so his claim was the dominant was attracted back to the tonic because he said it was the note returning back to its source. So in other words, the dominant is a note within the source, but it really must go back to the source, which would be the fundamental bass of the tonic. I don't know if that makes sense, but
that's Rameau's understanding.
That's Rameau's idea. He spoke the dominant pitch returning back. Now, in a scale, we wouldn't normally think that the fifth scale degree needs to go to the tonic. So when we're looking at a melodic organization, I'm not so sure that we think that the fifth scale degree must return or leap directly. But in a bass line, on the other hand, in order to bring the sense of closure to a melodic bass line and to a formal unit, then it does seem that, at least for the classical composers, and I think for practically all of the 18th century and most 19th century composers, the dominant needs to be in a root position with the fundamental bass of the dominant that leaps down to the tonic and makes this kind of wonderful harmonic connection. Not a melodic connection, but a truly harmonic connection in the bass voice.
So you agree with that then?
I agree that in the bass, yes, that the dominant has a natural affinity to want to return to the tonic. Sometimes it gets delayed in its path. It moves up to 6, and we get something we might call a deceptive progression or a deceptive cadence, perhaps. Or maybe the dominant moves somewhere else, and the idea that it might form a cadence gets abandoned or evaded in some way. But ultimately, we would really like to hear in the bass voice that dominant leap right down to the tonic to bring the cadence.
Now, before we continue along this vein of thought, I want to raise something that I found very, very interesting. Let me read you a quote of yours. The so-called plagal progression, 1-4-1, is entirely inadequate to the task. The subdominant harmony does not contain the essential elements, especially the leading tone, to set up powerful expectations for a resolution to a stable tonic. Instead, the progression is entirely suited to a prolongational role, especially seeing as the common tone between the harmonies is the root of the tonic. If the plagal progression does not fulfill the requirements of a true cadential progression, then the formal construct of a quote-unquote plagal cadence, described in virtually every music theory textbook on rudiments in harmony, must be seen as a fiction. Wow, now that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I have to ask you, Professor Caplin, does the plagal cadence exist?
Okay, so I'm entered into these discussions all of the time. I guess I'm a bit of a radical on this position. But
that's good.
I really believe, let me back up just a little bit, because you spoke about prolongational progressions, or were quoting me. And I think this is something that's really, really important for my particular approach to harmony and to form. And that is distinguishing progressions that are used to sustain in our imagination, and this is a Schenkerian idea, prolonging a particular harmony, as opposed to the sense of a cadential progression of harmonies where we feel that there's a real march from a tonic to a predominant, to a dominant, back to a tonic. And the cadential progression, I claim, is a different kind of progression of harmonies than a prolongational progression. Now, what's interesting is that we find that these different types of progressions are used in different places within the phrase structure or the form of a thematic unit, let's say. That prolongational progressions are very good to begin the musical ideas. Then we often will have sequential progressions, which we might find in the middle of ideas. But then to really give the impression of how we are to end something, we want to have this very specific thing of a cadential progression, which allows tonic to really emerge as the focal point of a harmony, of a key, which is, I think, so important. Now, the plagal progression, 1-4-1, simply does not have, as I said in the quote, does not have the kinds of structures that allow the tonic to really emerge as not just a tonic harmony, but really the tonic of a tonality.
It might be interesting, where did the term plagal cadence come from?
Great question. It was only about 2 years ago that somebody wrote an article on this in in our society's journal. I read it and then kind of forgot it. It was some obscure theoretical treatise that this fellow located the use of plagal or plagal cadence. Of course, it does relate to modal theory from the medieval period, when people spoke of plagal and authentic modes. But that probably is where somewhat of the source of the modern theory is.
So you're saying that in 18th century music, it's very hard to find this so-called plagal cadence.
Right. But the reason is it's not hard to find plagal progressions of harmony. But cadences, actual units that are used to close musical themes, those use dominant harmony going to tonic entirely through the 18th century, through most of the 19th century, but in the 19th century, composers start actually to writing something that I'll concede would be a kind of plagal cadence that's totally replacing our expectation of a of an authentic cadence, 5 going to 1. Now, what most people think are plagal cadences when they hear them in the 18th and 19th century, this is the so-called Amen cadence, where the progression goes 1, 4, 1. I'm just going to go to the piano real quickly. That would be a standard plagal cadence. But really, that is a cadence that we find that comes after the regular cadence. So the real cadence, the thing that really marks, if you will, the end of the theme, the end of the thematic unit, that moment is articulated by an authentic cadence, 5/7 going to 1. But then we can have the plagal progression. And what I like to say is that the plagal progression is associated with an after the end situation. So you think of a horse race, and the horses, they go, and then as soon as the horse crosses the line, the race is effectively over. But there still is the winding down. The horses run a little bit longer, and there's still commentary about what's happened in the race. That all happens after the end of the race. And I think that music features after the end things a lot of the time.
Well, could you give an example of such a thing?
Well, let me pull one up from my website. It's filled with all of the examples in the textbook. So let me see if I can find one that has a good set of codettas here. I think we're going to hear the cadence come first. It's from a Haydn piano sonata.
Okay.
And then we should be able to hear the sense of the codettas that immediately follow this. Okay, that's a codetta. There's another codetta. And now one final codetta. So what I missed there was actually the cadence. I should have had an example that actually has the cadence.
Let's go into just the types of cadences then that you would categorize. Is it pretty standard then? Authentic cadences, deceptive cadences, half cadences? Do you still maintain those formats?
Yes. Well, as a music theorist, one of the problems that you have is that you want to present new ideas, or you develop new concepts, or perhaps you make refinements. But if you invent entirely new terminology, you're not going to get too many people on board. So I think music theorists, and I especially, like to hold on to as many of the terms as I can and try to use the traditional terms, even if they're not always the very best. So yes, I do speak of authentic cadences. I speak of the perfect authentic cadence, where the melody resolves to the tonic scale degree. The imperfect authentic cadence, where the melody ends up on 3. Half cadences end on the dominant. And then there are deceptive cadences. And I even introduced 2 other types of cadences that I find pretty important. The evaded cadence, where we feel that the cadence didn't even come to an end. Or what's a second type that I call the abandoned cadence, where we don't even, we think we're going to do something cadential, and then the composer basically walks away from it, sort of gives it up, doesn't even let it come close.
If we could get technical then, so an evaded cadence, if you go to a 5, where do you go from the 5 for an evaded cadence?
So for an evaded cadence, you could go to a variety of places. You could go back to 1. It could even be 1 in root position. It could be a 1/6. You could try doing the cadence again. Hey, I pulled up a good example of an evaded cadence if you'd like to hear one.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so this is a Mozart piano sonata. Your listeners will probably be somewhat familiar with it. So I'll play it, and you're going to hear what sounds like the cadence, and then he's not going to give us the ending chord. He's going to back up and do what we had again, as my colleague Janice Schmalfeld calls it, the one more time technique. Let's try it one more time.
Okay.
So I'll play it for you. Get ready. Evaded. Now a real cadence. So evaded cadences are very good for extending the music on further in time, not letting us get the closure that we desire, but pushing it off into the future so that we eventually do get the closure, and then it's more interesting.
What about the abandoned cadence? How does that look technically?
That's a complicated one. That really is a complicated one. What's happening is the composer is starting with, let's say, a tonic chord, a 1-6, moving to a predominant, let's say, a 2-6. And we're expecting dominant to come into the picture. And maybe the composer even gets us to the dominant. But then the bass line, let's say, rises up further and the dominant becomes inverted. In other words, the dominant becomes undermined as a true cadential dominant. So it seemed like it was going to be cadential, and then there was this kind of undermining of it. And that's a good example of an abandoned cadence. I could pull up an example, I think, for you quickly. So what's going to happen is that we're going to hear the theme. It's going to seem like it's going to bring a cadence, but if you listen carefully, we kind of merge right out of the cadence, and then the whole passage is repeated, and we really do get a good cadence. The best thing is if you can hear the bass voice in the left hand. I'll ask the listeners as much as possible to do that, but I'll point out where the abandonment happens.
Okay.
That's the first idea. Repeat of the idea. Now a continuation. Get ready for the cadence. Now. Ready. Oh no, he moved through it. Now it's repeated. And here's our nice dominant tonic, and we get a good cadence that ends the theme. So it's subtle. It's the courses that I teach on this are intermediate to advanced courses. So as I said, the grounding and harmony is so critical, and then one could begin to work on this kind of material.
Do you depart from Ratz and Schoenberg in your theoretical work?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that I depart from them in kind of different ways. Schoenberg was very interested in showing how motivic connections are found in pieces of music. When we think of his theories today, we mostly think of his theories of developing variations and the idea of motivic transformations and the like. I don't really find that motivic work has that much to do with the theory of form that I'm interested in. So in that sense, I don't quite follow Schoenberg. With Ratz, I do follow him to a good degree. And in fact, Ratz is the first person who really, I should say he developed more systematically Schoenberg's ideas of formal functionality, the idea that individual units have a very particular role to play. Now, Ratz developed this at very broad levels of the structure, but I'm interested in showing how formal functions can work from the very foreground 1-bar, 2-bar ideas all the way up to the entire stretch of the musical composition as a whole, which is why I call my theory a theory of formal functions. It largely builds upon the basis that Schoenberg and Ratz laid for me, and then I basically am doing a major refinement and elaboration of the theory. So it isn't so much that I am opposed to the things they say. I'm trying to enrich the topic and make it a more comprehensive approach than what they were interested in doing.
If we took, like, for instance, a Mozart or a Haydn piano sonata, and how would your formal analysis differ from a Ratz or a Schoenberg? Okay,
so I'll give you an idea from what Ratz does. When Ratz when he talks about the main theme, he will use many of Schoenberg's categories, the sentence and the period, and will analyze the piece in terms of its phrase structure. But when he then starts talking about the subordinate theme, which both he and Schoenberg describe as more loosely organized than the main theme, then Ratz tends to just kind of define, I'll start that again. Ratz tends to simply list a series of numbers which indicate the bars that are happening. So he'll say, there's a 4-bar unit, and then a 3-bar unit, and now another 4-bar unit, a 2-bar unit, a 2-bar unit, a 1-bar unit. So that's an interesting description of sort of the lengths of the groups. But what I do, or what I've been trying to do, is to develop a theory that allows me to give labels and categories to what the functions are of all of those phrases within, let's say, a more loosely organized subordinate or secondary theme of a sonata exposition, for example. So I try to find ways of describing formal functionality at all the different levels of a musical composition, whereas Ratz and Schoenberg tended to focus more on the large scale.
Where do you find that your theories that, and everyone making a theory often finds there's certain situations where it's tougher to use it and some situations where it's absolutely perfect for a lot of things. Where have you found the difficulty and you've needed to refine your theory more in certain situations looking at 18th century music?
Wow, that's a great question. First of all, if we start to look at music that even is before the classical style, then we really do have to somewhat refine our categories because what Bach does is similar in ways to what Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn do, but really on the surface of the music quite different. Even in the Galant period, Scarlatti and CPE Bach, they also do formal things that are different. So I really think that my theory most ideally fits that of the classical style. Now, within there are places in compositions that come up all of the time that are tricky. My theory can't explain absolutely everything that happens. I don't try to do that.
No theory can, I guess, right?
No theory can. Absolutely. I consider my theory to be a partial theory of music. It deals with a slice, a particular set of problems. But undoubtedly, I'm running all of the time into cases where the composers are doing something so interesting. Many times they're simply ambiguous, and I could use different categories of form to explain what they're doing. At other times, they seem to be doing something just simply quite idiosyncratic.
Could we take an example of where you found the theory just works so well, and then another particular tune or a particular piece where you found it's a little tricky?
That's a good one. Let me think. Well, the piece that I use as my general teaching piece, which is the ones that both Ratz and Beethoven used, excuse me, Ratz and Schoenberg, it was Beethoven who composed the piece, and this is his very first piano sonata. And his very first piano sonata, I'll play the main theme. It's the perfect example of the sentence form as Schoenberg defines it, and Ratz and myself. I'll play it for you. It consists of a 2-bar idea, the repetition of the idea, and then the breaking down of the idea into 1-bar units, and then a final cadence, which in this case is a half cadence. And this takes 8 bars. You want to listen to it?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Idea, repeat, breaking down, cadence. That's it. That's the entire main theme. Now, let's compare that to the subordinate theme. Well, let's compare it to the transition that happens next, okay? So what happens here, is we have the opening idea. It turns out to be in the left hand. Then we get a passage of sequencing, something we didn't find in the main theme at all. Then we get a half cadence, and we get a series of what we might call as codettas that follow the half cadence, but Ratz introduced a nice term that he calls a standing on the dominant. And this is, again, a kind of after the end effect. Now let's listen to the transition. It's made up of 12 bars. It's made up of 11 bars rather than 8. It's not nice and symmetrical as the main theme was. Let's listen to it. Opening idea, sequence, half cadence, now repeating the cadential idea, further repeating of it to reinforce it. Now, that's a somewhat more loosely organized piece, but it follows very much into the tradition that my theory presents. It's not a difficult case. Let me play now a subordinate theme. This is the subordinate theme that now follows. And whereas the main theme was 8 bars long, this theme is 28 bars long. So it's considerably more extended. I'll try to talk it through as we listen to it. New idea, repeat. Repeat again, but now breaking down. Breaking down, Further, further. Now the cadential material. Oops, evaded. And now the cadence. And here are the codettas that follow the cadence. So this was a considerably more complicated structure, but it fit the principles pretty well, because one of the things that I really try to do is to be able to account for not only just main themes, but all of the different thematic units within a piece.
You're colleagues with Professor Robert Gjerdingen and Sanguinetti, and you know them.
Yes.
You're good friends with them. You mentioned in an interview on the Art of Composing. I love that interview. He was asking you as well about how this integrates with Partimenti. You commented. You said many of the schemata. You were very complimentary of Gjerdingen's work. He said, and you also added many of the schemata that he talks about. He doesn't give always such clear form functional descriptions exactly how those schemata work form functionally. There's a degree of it, his work. So basically, could you elaborate on what's missing there and how can we add form functional descriptions to perhaps these ideas?
Yes, well, I think that it's very feasible to do it, and that there are a number of theorists that are beginning to do this more regularly. There's a theorist who was a colleague of Bob Gjerdingen's at Northwestern University by the name of Vasily Biros, and he's written a number of articles that have really tried to integrate the schemata theory or the schema theory of Gjerdingen's and the form functional theory of my own. I've also written a big article that actually deals with, I think, the schema that is most important in Gjerdingen's work. This is the so-called printer schema. And I talk about how the printer can be, the basic shape of the printer can be found, but with different harmonizations. And depending upon the harmonizations, it can have different kinds of formal functions. In particular, it can have either a kind of middle function, or as he calls a riposte, Bob calls it a riposte, or it could have a real ending function, that you could have a printer that actually is functioning to make a cadence. And so the way in which we look at the harmonization of the schema can really bring this then in line with formal functions. There just simply are certain schemata that seem most appropriately found at the beginning of a piece, something that we find more typically in the middle of things that we find that brings closure, what he'll call the clausula schemas, or schemata, excuse me. And then after the ending schemata, there's a really lovely one he calls the quiescenza in Italian. And that's one that we find frequently at the ends in the after the end codetta kinds of sections. So I think theorists are beginning to integrate the theories in ways that are really interesting and productive.
Both of you studied with Leonard Meyer, the pioneering musicologist who wrote the famous 1956 book Emotion and Meaning in Music. Did he have any influence in your work after you studied with him?
Yes. In fact, I have been so fortunate to have such great teachers in my life. I had Nadia Boulanger, Karl Dahlhaus, Edward Lewinsky, the musicologist at the University of Chicago. But of all of those, I would say that Meyer's work probably ended up influencing me the most. Not so much on a technical level, although to some extent, but more in an aesthetic approach, more in a phenomenologically oriented way of listening to the expectations or the implications that music bring, and how those expectations or implications might be realized or evaded or avoided or deferred, but then eventually realized again. And that kind of listening right on the very surface of the music to the very subtle details that happen, as you talked about, how pitches attract to each other and so forth and so on. I think Meyer's work was very influential, and I would credit him as having the biggest influence on me academically. If you could summarize, and this is very difficult, but like for people who are not familiar with a general understanding of form for certain composers, how is Haydn different from Mozart in formal construction, and how is Mozart different from Beethoven in formal construction? Wow, those are huge questions. They're wonderful questions. And what's interesting is that in the context of the books that I've been writing on this, I have been treating them as basically one repertoire to analyze. Yes, Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven in a number of ways are quite different. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Haydn's Haydn tends in sonata form movements, and the sonata forms are normally made up of an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of this. In Mozart and Beethoven, the recapitulation tends to follow largely what happened in the exposition with certain fundamental changes, but largely the same. Haydn, on the other hand, and I think it's because he's got a foot still in the Baroque era, Haydn tends to modify his recapitulations often quite strikingly. So those are aspects of the form that are quite different from what Mozart and Beethoven do. Mozart, on the other hand, tends to write very short development sections in his sonatas. Haydn, on the other hand, and Beethoven write much more expansive development sections. Mozart's are relatively short and compact. Beethoven, of course, expands the form enormously over what we find in Haydn and Mozart, and he introduces new techniques of how to make more complex, hierarchically rich structures that then lead us into 19th century forms that are then become quite different from classical style.
I know he imitated Mozart quite a bit in his early stages. How did he break the form, and what pieces can we really see are good exemplars of him changing the form?
Sure. So I'll say that you're absolutely right. In his earlier works, Beethoven was more influenced probably by Mozart. But then I think that Haydn's influence started to really come to bear. So one can find ways in which he was influenced, I think, markedly by both Haydn and Mozart. So what are the works? I think everybody normally points to the middle period works of Beethoven, certain heroic pieces such as the Waldstein Sonata, the Kreutzer Sonata, the Opus 59 string quartets, and then, of course, the really monumental break with the size of formal units, and this is the Eroica Symphony, Symphony Number 3. And then a number of his symphonies continuing on. The Sixth Symphony, quite expansive, until we get the most monumental of all with the Ninth Symphony. These are works whose proportions are way exceed that we normally find in Haydn and Mozart. And so we see Beethoven using the same fundamental formal principles, but simply finding these incredible ways of building bigger and bigger, more complex pieces. It's a little bit like going from a nice city church to a huge Gothic cathedral. Sometimes the architectural metaphors are helpful here.
What do you find students find the most challenging, and how do you think, if somebody is approaching your work, what's the best way to, maybe what things do you need? Apart from harmony, is there other ways that you can go through the challenges of understanding this work in an easier way?
Okay, so traditionally, the theory of form generally directed listeners' attentions to the upper voice, to the melodies. In other words, let's listen to a first theme. And they will hear a musical idea, and they'll call that the first theme. Then we'll hear a transition. Maybe there isn't anything that's very striking as a melody within that section. Now we come to the secondary theme, or the second subject, or the subordinate theme. Now we have a nice, and if I dare say, feminine, quote, lovely melody being found here. This was the traditional old-fashioned way of thinking about listening to form, where you listen to the tunes in their successions. My theory, as I say, directs us more to harmony, and here maybe my answer to your basic question is, the challenge I have with my students is often getting them to listen to the bass line. This is very difficult for sopranos, for trumpet players, clarinetists, violinists. They just don't hear down there. I'm asking them to look into the basement or try to imagine the foundation rather than the ornaments that you find on the building. And if you can listen to the bass line, if you can attend to what's happening there, you will start to grasp not only harmonic and tonal structures, but you'll start to grasp the main formal structures as well. Now, I'm not saying you don't listen to the tunes. Of course, they're important. And aesthetically, they're the most interesting part most of the time. Bass lines themselves can be rather boring. They're there for structural purposes, not for the expressive rhetorical purposes that are also an important part of music.
Does counterpoint have a place in the theoretical framework?
Generally, it doesn't end up having that much. We find that contrapuntal, or as I prefer to call them, polyphonic textures, occur in certain places formally. We find them in the development sections, particularly. Sometimes we'll even find fugal passages in the development of a sonata form, for example. But counterpoint per se is not an area that relates all terribly well to formal or to form or to formal functions. This is not to say that counterpoint isn't important. Of course it is. And one of the things that we try to get we try to get musicians to be able to listen to, of course, are the multiplicity of lines that are happening within pieces, so they can hear where lines are going. And so thinking polyphonically or listening that way is very, very important. And of course, for composers, counterpoint still remains an essential part of their training.
Now, you've focused on Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, but I want to ask you personally, what music do you like that you feel has great form?
Oh, there's so much. And I've, in the last number of years, really been devoting much more time to actually listening very broadly musically. Now that my kids are growing up and I have more time to do these kinds of things, I'm listening to so much music. I've kind of completely fallen in love with Sibelius lately.
What does Sibelius do with the form that intrigues you?
Oh, Sibelius is very different formally. He develops his forms much more from smaller little ideas that progressively get more elaborate and larger in scope. He tends not to follow many of the traditional forms. And to be really honest, I haven't analyzed Sibelius. I've mostly just been listening to him for the pleasure that I find in his music. Brahms, of course, is always a composer that I love listening to. Bruckner's forms, they're complicated. I think that he was thinking form functionally, but we really need to develop some tools we still need to work on tools for analyzing Bruckner.
Now, you mentioned Bruckner. You wrote an article about Simon Sechter, who was yes. He was the teacher of Bruckner by mail, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I don't know the modality, but yes.
Talk a little bit about Sechter. What tradition does he follow?
Sure. Well, Sechter is the ideal music Viennese music theorist. He was the archetypal. That's the word I was looking for. Viennese music theorist. Basically, quite conservative, but with such must have had a good personality, because he started to teach Schubert before Schubert died, and then he ended up teaching Bruckner, and he had a whole series of very important composers that he taught, and musicians in Vienna in the middle of the 19th century.
I was so intrigued just to see how people are so adamant about their particular camp of music theory that I remember I read in one of your things was a Wason review who did I think he did a Viennese harmonic theory from Albrechtsberger to Schenker to Schoenberg.
Yes.
And then you, at the end of the article, you mentioned that it's a great thing, it's a great book, but maybe he could kind of tone down the Riemann bashing.
Yes, this is my colleague Robert Wasson from the Eastman School of Music. In fact, we were doing history of theory lecture panels at the Society for Music Theory many times together, so I knew him quite well. He wrote a wonderful book. It was his dissertation on the Viennese music theoretical tradition. Remember, I mentioned early in our interview that the influence of Heinrich Schenker was very significant on why many theorists kind of didn't pay much attention to musical form, because Schenker was pretty hostile to form. Well, Schenker was also very hostile to Riemann. And so many of the music theorists in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, who were getting their training where Schenker was so important, tended to have a kind of anti-Riemann bias. This has really changed over the last 20 years, maybe even 30 years now, where Riemann has come very much more into his own, and people are appreciating his theories of form and his theories of rhythm and his theories of harmony.
Can I ask you really quickly about Kirnberger? Sure. Okay. He was fundamental bass theory, but I guess influenced by Rameau. But didn't I read somewhere that C.P.E. Bach mentioned that his dad, Johann, was kind of iffy on Rameau, and maybe they respected him, but they didn't really know his work, they didn't use his work. And it's interesting because I think Forkel, who is the biographer of Bach, said, look at Kirnberger's book, because that is how Bach did it. And right. So could you make sense of all of that? Okay,
sure. So let me try. First of all, of course, C.P.E. Bach was the son of Johann Sebastian Bach, and obviously learned directly his studies of music from his father. But Kirnberger also did study with Johann Sebastian Bach. And he claims that his theories represent the way in which Bach taught his students. And there are aspects of Kirnberger's theories that very much are in the way J.S. Bach taught. But at the same time, Kirnberger ended up absorbing, probably without necessarily being so clear about it himself, absorbing Rameau's theories of harmony. And in fact, he took on and extended Rameau's theories of the fundamental bass. Now, C.P. Bach was hostile to Rameau through his entire career. In fact, his big book on the
true art,
the true art, it's a theory of figure bass that has absolutely no reference to harmonic theory. It's as though harmony did not exist, even though it was written about 30 years after Rameau. Kirnberger, on the other hand, did borrow and use many of Rameau's ideas, but he didn't realize, I don't think, that it was really Rameau who had instituted them. As a result, he followed along in C.P. Bach's condemnation of Rameau, and he said, oh, no, my work has nothing to do with Rameau. So there are these wonderful ironies where people are influenced in ways that they're not even quite aware of. And until later on, we can come back and sort these matters out.
Professor Caplin, have you, one of the final questions is, have you dipped into non-German theories of harmony and analysis, like from the Russian or French and the Italian? What do you think of those other nationalities of analyzing harmony and form?
Right. Well, to be really honest, I haven't really worked there. So I think it would be a mistake for me to try to generalize. I'm a little bit familiar with the French system of harmony. As I said, I studied with Boulanger, and we learned some of that, which is a fairly idiosyncratic system in certain ways in which they label things, but otherwise is fairly traditional. The Italian approach is fairly traditional. I'm not speaking of the Parlamento, just general. The Italians were not big music theorists in the 18th or 19th century, as much as the Germans were and the French. And then there's even an English tradition. And so there are a variety of traditions that are interesting to look at. To be honest, I simply have not worked with them. I did a lot of history of theory when I was doing my dissertation work, the things we've been talking about with Sechter, Riemann, Kirnberger, for example. But my later work on form has really been more my own theoretical formulations than so much working with other traditions.
If you could reform music education, and perhaps with the theoretical work that you've done, how would you reform music education? And because I know that right now ton of kids are reading about the plagal cadence, they're reading about this, and they're putting it down in their exam. So how would you reform music education, and what things would you do?
Oh boy, this is a tough one. I mean, I suppose I would try to, as I've said so many times in our discussions, try to get educators to show students that they must listen to what's happening in the bass. I know I'm becoming repetitive, but I can't tell you that to me this is the most important thing. When somebody says, what do you listen for in music? Now, of course, when I'm listening for just pure enjoyment, I listen to everything, and I'm not analyzing anything.
Right.
But when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I really listen to the bass. And I think this is important for music education to get that focus back on the bass line. Otherwise, I think in music education, the main problem that we have is that we are teaching music students at the university level music theory that really they should be being taught at when they're about 12 or 14.
This is very late.
It's late for them, and as a result, it's in some ways it's too easy, and in other ways it's too hard because they're just not so quick to pick up and absorb some of these rudimentary skills that are just so terribly important for doing music theory. I wish we just could bring back more theoretical training to our students at younger ages, that performance teachers and high school music teachers would find ways of trying to give students some basic vocabulary and understanding of musical structure at a much earlier age, so that when they start doing music school as professionals, they've already come really well trained. Luckily, in Canada, we have a very fine Royal Conservatory tradition that so many of our students do come with wonderful backgrounds in music theory. But I think in the United States, it's much more of a challenge. There's been such terrible cutbacks in the arts that so many music programs just don't even exist anymore, not to speak of music theory programs. So I think the reform has to come more in that direction, to be honest.
What books can you recommend to somebody harmony books? Well, do you recommend any harmony books?
Sure. There's a pretty good harmony book out in the market now by a fellow named Poundy Burstein and Joseph Strauss, both very top-notch music theorists, both with a fairly Schenkerian orientation, but the musical harmony book that they've written, I think it's called A Concise Theory of Harmony or A Concise Study of Harmony. I forget exactly the title, but I think it begins with a concise of. And now I'm not sure who publishes it, but it's not a big book that has too many words. It's kind of directly gets you going on the fundamentals of harmony, and I think that's a really nice book.
Fantastic. Well, the great Professor Caplin, thank you again so much for coming onto the show and just sharing all this great information. It's really fascinating. I can't wait to continue reading your book. It really is a great read, and I highly recommend my audience to check it out. Professor Caplin, do you have anything you'd like to mention apart from the book on cadences? Oh, you should mention the website with all the free materials.
The website. If you just search Analyzing Classical Form, I think it'll be the first thing that comes up. And the website doesn't have any theory in it, but it's got hundreds and hundreds of musical passages and examples. And you can get some idea of how the book is organized. And the performances are really nice, mostly done by our students at McGill. And the orchestral pieces were actually computer simulated. They're not maybe perfect, but they're pretty good for teaching.
Well, Professor Caplin, thank you again for coming on the show. I hope you come on again to talk about your cadence book. Although we covered a lot, I still believe there's plenty more to talk about. We've only scratched the surface. I hope you had fun, and
I really enjoyed it, Nikhil. It was really
and I hope to talk to you again soon. Professor Caplin, thank you.
Thank you so much.